Hello and welcome. Thanks to WovenInPractice and Huddersfield University for allowing me to showcase my research. The research is named The Potential for Sustainable Use of Waste Digital Print Products into Handcrafted Textile Prints. This was part of my MA in Fashion and Textile Design that I studied in 2018 at Nottingham Trent University. The research regarding the recovery of waste digital dyes and waste fabrics was a large element of my studies. My initial interest in dye recovery was as a creative challenge really, and as I have a background in fine art printmaking, and I have a deep interest in the processing of materials and textile print. I'm normally to be seen, in the bottom left hand side, in a manual screen printing workshop or a colour mixing lab, and testing unusual combinations of print materials. I've got absolutely nothing against digital print onto fabric, but I do like to be physically involved in the process of my print and printmaking. On the right you can see a Mimaki large format printer similar to the one they were using in the university, and on the right you can see lower down you can see the white tub where they collect the waste dyes from every single print, and on the top on the left you can see the colour cartridges up there. I've just put that in for reference so that you know where I'm talking about, where the inks are coming from. And on here as well there are just a couple of pieces of information, and basically one of the most important things to remember with digital print industry waste is that not only does the ink need to be disposed of, but also the cartridge, and also when you are attaching the fabric onto the printmaker there's going to be unavoidable fabric offcuts when you're testing the print heads and when you're rolling on and off and when you're just starting a print. These are my initial experiments, and these are using the waste dye that is collected post-print. You should also know as well that the title for my MA was Drawing in a Three-Dimensional World and how this relates to textile design. I'm developing ways of mark making that refresh surface prints with authenticity and experimentation by using lots of different tools and materials and working on locations. My initial tests seen here are using post-print digital waste, which is collected in the white container that I pointed out underneath the printer. And as these are from one particular machine, the reactive dye colour was burgundy, and I didn't have a choice in that. It's all of the inks mixed together, all of the waste inks collected, and the acid dye is a very dark sort of navy blue. And the fabric supplier that I found that had roll end coated fabrics, not always in great condition, but sometimes in very good condition, were from Whaley's in Bradford, who were really great to deal with. I'm just going to read from my workshop book now, a couple of test print assessments that relate to some of these experiments on the screen. So silk twill, which is top middle, acid dye waste. It's darker and the oversaturated areas show a pale blue halo. This appears during the steaming process. The water added areas still are showing on the fabric despite my concerns that the water would reduce the digital coating. And then we've got organic cotton, coated cotton, that's with reactive dye, and this is on the right hand side at the top. The dye is applied directly by using a very small squeegee, dipping it into a tray of reactive. Showing the range of light and dark tones that can be fixed to the cotton, it appears to be very sensitive to light touch. So this is the next range of secondary experimentation. This is working on a much bigger scale and still hand applied, working in a controlled environment in a workshop. The main concern with the hand application onto the coated fabric surfaces is the oversaturation effects. If you think about the print head of a print machine, it emits a very fine spray, but I'm using my hands and I'm using found tools, I'm using brushes, I'm using ink bottles, and I'm using a screen print. There's less control. Some areas are unevenly coated by myself, and with all that human intervention and error there are going to be slight splashes, etc. My initial concerns were proved correct in that a repeated drawing mark on some of these pieces on here oversaturated the fabric coating, so that's the digital coating already on the fibre, and some of this caused areas to bleed, and then there was a slight dye transfer onto non-coloured areas. And I don't mean that the pattern was printed onto another area during the steaming and the processing. I mean that the non-printed areas took on a hue, very, very pale, sometimes pink, sometimes lilac. And that was something that didn't seem to be avoided with this kind of the style of adding in the drawing onto the direct to the textiles. A lot of my work was done in a workshop, but eventually, as I mentioned earlier, I started to work outside of the workshop, and I took the fabric pieces from that secondary experiment outside to be photographed. And this is where I got the ideas to have external textile installations, and this is just showing off the movement of the fabric. My location of choice for working was a piece of wasteland that I'd found accidentally while I was mountain biking. It was an old disused jet engine testing site for Rolls-Royce, and it's near Hucknall in Nottinghamshire. I'd already collected, and you can see from here, I've already collected photos and sketchbooks of mark making, of colour collections, so you can see the one in the middle with all the colour sampling on there, and I've already collected images, and I've started to work at the same time as they're developing the digital waste. I'm working on a piece of wasteland. This slide shows how I developed my colourways back in the colour lab, working to recipe specifications from the original Procyon ICI mixing books, mainly using reactive dye powders in this case, taking these colours and matching them to my location sketchbook that we saw previously. And these were tested on a range of cellulose and silk fabrics. And then it became apparent that after the university closed down and the break, it transpired that the chip on the digital dye cartridges had expired and that the cartridges would need replacing. So I was now in possession of pre-print digital waste dyes, which are the original colours that were showing on the Mimaki digital printer. They would be on the top side, so they're the pure colours, and I was now in possession of them. So the liquid dyes, reactive dyes, that I was now in possession of, they would have been sent to be safely disposed of at cost. And I suddenly realised that my colour mixing options using these waste dyes had increased exponentially. And here I am using a pipette and weighing out the liquid dyes in the colour lab. And I decided to investigate to see if I could colour match the digital dyes to my Procyon hand mixed colour recipes. So I've got all my colour samples already on my fibres. I wanted to see if I could match them with these digital waste dyes, but it was a really lengthy process. As digital liquid dyes are very concentrated, I didn't have a guide recipe, so what I'm working to is my own colour and devising my own recipes, and I was measuring liquids now and not powders. And digital dyes after steaming have a very cool edge to their hue, so there was a lot of trial and error and a lot of practice going on. So on this slide you can see the trial and error of mixing, printing, steaming, washing, drying and assessing and repeating. I made 2 different types of the waste digital inks to try out. I made out a monoprint liquid waste using the dye colours, and I also made a more viscous screen print paste as well, which you can see at use on here. So all the time that the workshop colour mixing and trials are going on, I'm actually also working on location on this piece of wasteland. And I suddenly realised that by using my colour matched digital waste print pastes, I could take those to the wasteland site and apply them directly to the roll end fabrics, which would really start to innovate my surface print, drawing with found objects and tools in my outdoor studio. And you can see at the bottom right hand side some of the sort of templates and things that I'd found that I started to use while I was out in that environment. As you can see from the images, There was plenty of space to unroll the fabrics, and I was working on canvas and cotton mixes such as cotton duck, and laying them out on my concrete tables and really getting into observing and responding to that environment. And once they were dried, so if you imagine it's like painting onto a canvas, but I know that when I steam that fabric, what I've painted is going to stay there. And when they've dried, I just roll them up and return them to the workshop to steam and wash the pieces. Once the coated fabrics were steamed and washed, they were no longer receptive to the direct application from those waste digital dyes that I'd mixed. I could, however, continue to work into the surfaces with screen print or with the Procyon dyes that I'd mixed before, or with novel finishing layers. And what I did was I took my digital waste pieces back to their origins, back onto the wasteland, and to draw and to set up installations and to photograph. And this really brought out the fine artist in me, looking at the source and trying to relate back the prints and the motifs and the drawings direct onto the rolls of fabric, relating them back into the environment where they came from. There were also workshop developments where I worked on what I call hybrid textile surfaces, where I was using non-textile base print pastes. So using industrial resist layers, using waterproofing pastes, and using stencils, and using on the stencils using a metallic to act as a resist at the same time. And on the stencil side, on the right hand side, the product could be viewed from the back or the front, and you've got a very, very different outlook on each side. Also in the workshop, I found that I could work with much finer, more delicate fabrics, investigating the digital waste roll ends still and the waste paste, but onto silk viscose satin, Fuji silk and fine jersey knits. And these weren't suitable for outdoor print applications to do with if you're laying something on a concrete surface, for example. It just wasn't conducive to what I was trying to, as I was trying to draw on direct onto those surfaces. The print outcomes using the digital dyes and coated fabrics in a craft and manual print method, they still retain the same elements that a digital print on a fabric would have. So they still retain the fabric handle, and they have an unaltered fabric surface, so they still look like fabric, but it also can be worked on top of in other layers. So in the same way that digital can be, it's just that this is more of a craft application. And here we can see some more of the novel finishing, and I took powders influenced by the wasteland. I started to use graphite powders, and I started to use iron oxide to replicate, you know, like the dirt and the dust and the rust that I'd seen in that environment. In the workshop then came the finale, at least I thought it was the finale. This is a 4-metre length of single knit jersey lycra mix, using a variety of screen printed motifs, the motifs that came from that wasteland and from my sketchbooks, and also from those initial tests using the digital waste onto the coated fabrics. These are hand applied with screens, with stencils, and then there are disperse and heat press elements on here too. But if you remember earlier, I talked about the drawn, hand drawn piece, where basically I talked about oversaturation. And rather distinctively, this piece, after steaming and washing, decided to turn first of all pink, and then after another complete process of washing, a very pale orange. And actually, I couldn't have foreseen that happening, but I had completely oversaturated where the orange and the red areas were lain. And basically this is the joy of innovation. I'd overlaid too many colours, I'd pushed it too far, but I only found this out after the washing phase. So actually I was a little bit distraught at this point, but there's some incredible mark making going on here, and I was actually quite pleased with how the process is very mechanical but very hand done at the same time. This was my final piece of my research. This is final piece part 2. It is a handcrafted research print which is predominantly using waste. It's an installation piece, And the timeline lower down shows you how these initial areas of innovation can take months to perfect. So on the timeline there, the colour sampling probably was around about 3 months, and the process sampling for just this one piece probably about 2 weeks, but the print itself took 3 days. And this was a 2-year project. This is my final slide. Thank you for listening. It's been really interesting putting this together for myself. I just wanted to say that in 2018 this project was awarded a Textile Society postgraduate bursary for dedication to eco-innovation, and I'm currently continuing my research this year with funded learning in Foundation Textile Coloration Chemistry, FTCC, with the Society of Dyers and Colourists, who I'm really grateful to. I'm also very grateful to the Textile Society and also Nottingham Trent University for their support. Thank you very much for listening.